Actually, no, I'll just go back. Okay, hello. So I'm Mitu Khandaker, and I run a one-woman indie studio called Tiniest Shark. And I guess I've just vaguely called my talk Lessons from a New One-Woman Indie Developer. I say new because compared to all the sort of really clever and talented people speaking here today, I am quite new. I've been doing this for 2 years. So I started my studio 2 years ago, and I just released my first game. So yeah, that game's called Redshirt, and I'm going to sort of talk a bit more about it in just a bit. The Tiniest Shark was one of the developed top 100 studios. I was lucky enough to somehow be nominated one of the BAFTA Breakthrough Brits, but none of that necessarily means that anything I can tell you will actually be of interest. So what I'm going to do is, for the first time, and this is an exclusive, I'm going to talk about how Redshirt has been doing. So as I said, it was released on Steam and GOG and direct download on the 13th of November. I'll talk a bit about sort of like figures and stuff, and then you can decide whether or not you want to listen to me for the rest of the talk. Redshirt basically recouped its costs in 3.5 days. So far, and I last checked the figures like 2 days ago or something, there were 7,000 copies sold, and it's grossed over $119,000. And that's sort of, and a large part of that has been, through Steam. I've got a pie chart here because I'm not presenting data unless I've got a pie chart. This is just the breakdown of the sort of sales over the different platforms. So the big Pac-Man shaped bit is obviously Steam, and the others are GOG and direct download, etc. Currently the game has been released on PC, Mac, and Linux, and I'm just finishing up the iOS build as well, so it's going to be out for iPad as well. As you can see, Redshirt is doing fairly okay, especially for what is basically quite a niche indie game. And I'll talk a bit more about sort of making niche games a bit later in the talk. But now I've sort of told you how it's doing, I'll actually tell you a bit about Redshirt and what it actually is. It is a sci-fi comedy social networking simulation game, which doesn't really tell you a whole lot because that's not a genre that people are generally familiar with, mostly because I just made it up. But it's basically a game about being the most insignificant person on this future space station. You're a new arrival, and everyone on the space station seems very annoyingly obsessed with a thing called Spacebook. And so you start off and you have the crappiest possible job on the space station, and you find that you have to try and use Spacebook to try and social network with like your superior officers, and get your boss to stop hating you, and try and sort of make friends and make enemies as you see fit. You want to stop being a redshirt before you meet your otherwise inevitable doom. Most of the gameplay, actually, is that going to start playing? Yes, but it's okay, whatever. Most of the gameplay takes place through this Spacebook interface you see here, which may or may not be a reference to certain social networking sites. You can read status updates by the other characters in the game, and it's a single-player game, so all the characters are basically AI-driven. You can basically strategically like statuses, you can write on people's timelines, you can send them messages, you can arrange Spacebook events, send friend requests, relationship requests, and so on. And you have like a certain number of action points a day that you can spend. So it's about sort of strategically managing those and making the right decisions and trying to work your way up this space station via any number of different means. Whether you're going to concentrate on that career tree that just came up and work hard, or just try and be like Mr. or Ms. Charisma and schmooze your way to the top. It's a game that plays out entirely via the sort of interface that you see here, and the core of the game is really about the sort of the relationships that you manage with the other characters, and so really just managing the politics of those relationships on board the station. So, that's the game, and it's sort of wrapped in this very silly, sort of tongue-in-cheek, Red Dwarf-esque, possible sci-fi dystopian future. So, I'm going to backtrack a bit, I'll just leave that playing, and just tell you a bit about how I became an indie developer. So, basically, since I was little, I've known I wanted to be either one of two things, either a game developer or an astronaut. And in this vague attempt to kind of hedge my bets, I decided to do computer engineering at university. And I did that to master's level, so I did an MEng, and I did that at the University of Portsmouth. And as a result of the final project that I did for my master's, I started doing a PhD in games technology at the same uni. And so I was doing that for a while, and I took a couple of breaks, and I did like an entrepreneurship scholarship in America to try and sort of gain business skills, and then I sort of got to this period where I was enjoying the work I was doing on the PhD, but I really just wanted to make things. Like, that's kind of what's important to me. So a few years ago, I actually co-founded, along with a few other people, a location-based games startup. And so I was working on that for a bit, and then for a number of sort of very complicated reasons, it sort of ended up morphing into sort of not really a game anymore. It was sort of more of this sort of gross Foursquare sort of clone type thing. And I realised very quickly at that point that wasn't what I wanted to do. Like, games have always been what's important to me, and I really just wanted to make games. Because there are so many directions in which games could possibly go, and there's so much that games haven't yet tapped into. And so I just wanted to, start making those games. So I decided to go it alone and start a one-woman independent game studio. I should say the experience of working on that startup that I mentioned was good because it taught me two things. Because I was sort of, for a lot of it, I was based out in Silicon Valley, sort of pitching to VCs, which is really being sort of thrown in the deep end of pitching. So that kind of gave me experience in doing that and not really being scared of doing that. So that was really useful. Another lesson it taught me, like I said, the sort of project morphed into this sort of not games thing. And I think that really speaks to the importance of really choosing who you work with, because the product my co-founders wanted to do was totally valid in its own right, but they didn't care about games in the same way that I did. So it's really important to choose the right people who share your motivation and share your goals, etc. So I decided to go it alone and start a one-woman independent studio, and I called it the Tiniest Shark. I often get asked why it's called that. It's for a number of different, quite silly reasons. Firstly, like, sharks as creatures have just been fascinating to me, since I was little. Particularly great white sharks, because they're like actual monsters that live on this earth. They've always been really terrifying. And so it was really about sort of, calling the company the Tiniest Shark was about taking this thing which is really terrifying, i.e. going it alone as an indie developer, and making it small and manageable and cute and personable. So that's the Tiniest Shark, and the shark is actually the shark in the logo, and I sort of consider it my mascot because it's kind of lonely being an indie developer. Is this going to progress? Yes. So I started experimenting with a few tiny projects for about the first month that I started the company. The company being myself. And at this point, I'd also moved back in with my parents as well. So my cost of living was really low. So I was kind of, fortunate that I could be in that position, and that my parents and family were like supportive enough that they were willing to, to support me while I did that. And then I basically, was working on these prototypes, and then I heard from a friend in the industry that Cliff Harris of Positech Games, who made sort of gratuitous space battles, gratuitous tank battles, and sort of the Kudos series and the Democracy series. I heard that he was looking to publish a small indie game by another developer. And I also knew another mutual friend who'd pitched to him unsuccessfully, so I decided I'd go and give it a shot as well. And this was partly because I was relatively fresh from the experience of pitching to these like VCs in Silicon Valley, and I decided if I could do that, then why not try and speak to this indie developer as well. So I didn't pitch one of the sort of small prototypes I'd started working on, but because there was this potential to for him to publish a game, I decided to pitch one of the concepts that I'd had floating around in my head for a while, and it was the concept was this social networking simulation game. And that's because I think social simulations are just a really interesting concept in games. Like, they're so underexplored. Obviously one of the most notable commercial examples is like The Sims. A large part of the reason for that is because it's difficult. It's difficult to make a social simulation. It's much easier, sort of, if you look at if you think about the technology of games, to just simulate objects hitting other objects. It's easier to do that than to tackle the sort of challenges of trying to figure out how people behave and trying to simulate people's behavior and stuff, and the way they interact. But the concept of basing a game entirely around sort of social interactions and trying to navigate them with characters, that was just really interesting to me. And added to that, like around the same time, I've been doing lots of ruminating about sort of social networking and what it all really means, and that was inspired partly by the sort of startup that I'd worked on, but also because I'd sort of, while I'd been in that world, like I'd seen the extremes that sort of it could be sort of taken to almost, and some of the ideas that were floating around, and sort of so I started becoming a bit more sort of cynical, I guess, about social networking, and added to that just sort of doing lots of thinking about the ways in which social networking have kind of changed the way that we interact, and I know I've had plenty, I joined Facebook in my second year of undergrad at uni, and there have been so many personal dramas that have just been exacerbated by social media, and I just think that's a really interesting concept, and I wanted to sort of explore that in a game. So basically I decided to go along and pitch it to Cliff Harris one day. We decided to meet in this rustic Wiltshire pub, and glam life of an indie developer and everything. At that time I thought I hadn't actually met him before, but it turned out that the previous year, or 2 years previous, we'd actually been at the same games networking event, and we'd ended up at the same very embarrassing session of karaoke as well after it. So that probably didn't do anything for his opinion of me, but nonetheless, students definitely go along to as many networking sessions as you can. But so you should, definitely do networking. So I pitched Redshirt to Cliff, and he liked the idea, but we sort of talked about it and decided that maybe the game needed a theme beyond just sort of vanilla sort of social networking simulation that I'd been wanting to make. So in the process of chatting about it, we came up with the idea that maybe it would be a good idea to sort of set the game aboard this future sci-fi space station. And I'm a sci-fi nerd, so that idea was was just really cool anyway, because I get to make lots of Star Trek and Red Dwarf puns. And it also just becomes this sort of commentary on our possible future in space. We can all be really cool and living on space stations in the future, but people are still going to be people, and they're still going to be all self-obsessed and want to talk about what they had for lunch and post pictures of their cats and stuff. So we decided to work together, and so Cliff decided to publish Redshirt, and here I am 2 years later. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of, how that all worked, like indie publishing and, the way that Redshirt was actually published. There are so many, there are more funding models than ever before available to you if you want to start working on games, and that's really exciting. It's a really exciting time to be making games. So I think indie publishing is just yet another way that we can sort of think about that, and another possible model to sort of add to the other ways of funding games. And the way that it works, or the way that it worked in my experience, is that it was very much like the traditional games publishing model, but really scaled down and just felt much more human. And, you know, because it was, you know, Positech basically funded development of the game and also managed the marketing and the business side of things. But also, you know, that was really fantastic because I'd never done any of that before. So it was almost like having a mentor in some ways because Positech is a one-person company and I'm a one-person company. So, you know, I could really just interact and deal with a human. And so I kind of think of it as like having like, you know, it's like stabilizers on, like when you're learning to ride a bike, like having Positech Games as my indie publisher was like wearing indie stabilizers, I suppose. Except the bike is indie game development. So really all I had to worry about was the actual sort of development process of the game, and you know, Cliff would be there to make sure that all the marketing things were being taken care of, and so another advantage to all of that was that I got to, you know, I got to show the game at various expos. Like I took it to Eurogamer, I took it to MCM Expo in London, and that's all stuff I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. So, you know, I'm really happy with the way that that all worked out. And of course, it really helped in getting Redshirt to platforms like Steam and like GOG because you know, that's difficult to do, and you know, getting that visibility is difficult to do if you don't have the advice of someone who's done it successfully lots of times before. And you know, so like I said, it's really like a mentoring relationship in so many respects. If I ever had problems with like, you know, even like a design problem or a programming problem, I could go to Cliff and he'd like be happy to help out with it. And I think this is something you should really try and take advantage of, even if you're not being like specifically indie published. Like indie developers are generally really helpful people, and if you know, send someone an email, you know, and if you're sort of earnest and genuine and you know, don't actually hassle or anything, they'll be willing to respond and help you. And you should really sort of, you know, take the wisdom that people who've done it before have accumulated, and try and learn from that. So, you know, another sort of part of the whole human element of it is, so when I pitched the game to Cliff originally, I thought that development was going to take, I was like, yeah, it's going to take me less than a year, way less than a year, it's fine. But of course, it ended up taking over 2 years. And, you know, part of that is because it's, you know, it's definitely the first game I've worked on of this scale. And it's, you know, I think sort of scoping issues are something you kind of come to learn through experience. And I think, you know, Cliff has been through all that before himself and was very understanding about that. So yeah, again, you know, that's the human element of indie publishing. So one thing to note, and another reason that I'm really glad to work with Positech is that when you're running even if you are running a one-person studio, you don't have to do everything yourself. Unless you're sort of in the incredibly gifted, like 0.1% of people who is good at absolutely everything and, you know, can do everything, is not only good at it, but can also do all of it sort of in a really timely fashion and stuff. You probably need some outside help. So, I mean, in terms of developing Redshirt, I did all the programming and the design and most of the writing, but I also, you know, there were also lots of bits I outsourced. So I outsourced the art, the UI art and the character art and the music and the voiceover, and because there was just so much content to write as well, I had some friends, you know, help me out with writing content, like all the possible Facebook statuses that NPCs could possibly have, etc. And I also had Luke Dickin, who's speaking later today, also help out with some AI consulting for the game as well, to sort of figure out how the characters would behave and stuff. So, you know, and this is sort of kind of how other successful one-person studios do it as well. That's, you know, that's how Positech and Cliff Harris does it. Like he does those things and outsources the same things. And, you know, for example, Jake Burkett with Raelian Games. So there's a lot of indies who do the sort of design and the programming, but then outsource the art and stuff. So it's really about realizing where your own limits lie, and where you may need help from other people. So unless you're sort of working with close friends and you've all agreed to work together on something, you're probably going to need to hire contractors. And this is why sort of, having the game published was so helpful, because I didn't have any money. And it was really the only way that I, at the time, could work on something of the scale of Redshirt at all. And it's amazing how even sort of a very 2D UI heavy game like Redshirt, like how much the costs of making it can really add up. And that's not even counting the things like marketing, etc. One of the lessons I had to learn throughout the whole process as well, which I still find difficult, but is that it's okay not to use things that you've already paid for as well. And there was one point in the development of Redshirt early on where the idea was to have sort of 3D character, like your avatar would be a 3D character who was like animating in real time in response to the stuff that was happening to your character. And now it's a 2D character instead, but we were looking at hiring sort of 3D artists to do that, 3D modelers. And so we worked with one person who was like a recent graduate. She didn't have a lot of experience yet, so it wasn't really expensive to do or anything. And we looked at her work and we decided it wasn't really working that well, so we decided to look for a more experienced 3D artist. And so we got another guy in to do I think he did like one model, and the cost that he was charging was like 10 times as much as this previous artist, basically, because he was so experienced. And then we saw that model in the game, and so decided that 3D models wouldn't work in the game at all because it just felt too jarring against the sort of 2D, the sort of 2D UI and stuff, and also the game sort of around that time switched from being this sort of real-time thing, which probably sounds kind of weird, to being a turn-based sort of more strategic, slow thing. So basically, 3D art wasn't going to work in the game at all, so we had to scrap all that work and all those costs, which I didn't want to do at the time, but this is one of the things that you kind of learn that you need to do. If something isn't working, there's no point in sticking with it for no reason. Even games of the type that Redshirt is can sort of end up costing a lot more than you think to make, especially if there is a skill set that you don't actually have yourself. So if you're a programmer who doesn't do art, etc. So obviously you need to think about how those resources are going to be funded. And the important thing to remember is that even if you are doing everything yourself, you yourself are a resource whose time and energy is being put into the game, and you kind of need to think about how that resource, as any resources are, is going to be paid for. You'll sort of sometimes hear of people claiming that a particular game didn't cost them anything at all to make, etc., which might be true, but that's generally true if the developer has some other form of income, or if if it's whether it's a full-time job, or if they're doing contract work on the side, or if they have family or partners who will support them or whatever. I was obviously fortunate enough to have Redshirt published by another indie who was able to fund the bits that I had to outsource. And even though I was paid some money to develop Redshirt, it wasn't enough to live on or anything. So as I mentioned before, I moved back in with my parents, and that's because I was fortunate enough that they were willing to support me. And I know that's not necessarily everyone's situation, so what I'm saying is that it's really just important to realise that kind of aspect of it. Nothing that you spend any time on is actually free per se. And I think in encouraging people to sort of just get out there and make games, I think we as a community, or even a culture, sort of sometimes forget to sort of really talk about how things are funded. So while you're in uni, or if you are living with parents, or whatever, or if you just have at a low outgoing cost at this point in your life, this is a really good time to be making games. Because just in any spare time you do get alongside whatever else you do. Because there's the old saying of sort of just keep trying, and even if you fail, keep trying, and generally that's only true for as long as you have the resources to keep trying, and obviously that doesn't always happen. And I've felt like in all the projects that I've been involved with, I've kind of really had to persevere and keep going, but that's because I had low outgoing costs and stuff at the time. So hopefully most of you are also at a point where you can do that as well. Like most of you are students, and you can just make things and start experimenting, and this is like the perfect time to do it. And it's really that beauty of like making things is really why I'm a developer. I mean, I got hooked on the magic of just making digital things when I was about 11 years old, and I got on the internet for the first time, and not that many people were online at that point, and websites were a new thing to me, and I was like, wow, how do I make one of these? So I just sort of taught myself like HTML and JavaScript, and just made some really embarrassing fan sites for the shows I loved. But it was just that sort of process of writing code and then seeing it turn into this thing that people can interact with and you can click on and stuff. And I just got really hooked on that feeling, and it still kind of is that for me. And that's why, that's why I like making digital things. And and with Redshirt, I've obviously been fortunate enough to be in a position where I've had the creative freedom to work on a completely new IP, which is my own, and that's been fantastic. I mean, and related to all of that, for me, the important thing is just, as I said before, making the games that I want to see in the world. Games have so much fantastic potential for expression, and we're only just seeing the tip of the iceberg for the kinds of ideas and the kinds of experiences that games can convey. And, and that's particularly true where more high-profile games are concerned. And I think that as indie developers who have creative freedom, I think it's really important to harness that freedom and treat it almost like a responsibility in some ways. After all, so what is the point of being an indie developer and having freedom if you're just going to sort of parrot the same kinds of, the exact same things that you see in other games? And it's really, that's also why it's so important for all devs to really engage with as much media as you can. Yes, play lots of different types of games, don't obviously stick to your favourite genre, but also just engage with lots of other media as well, like read books and see movies and experience the world, and and it's really that we need to sort of like really just keep games going and expand them as a medium. So yeah, I sort of treat it as a responsibility as an indie developer, and it's a responsibility to take on sort of challenging ideas and try and develop them. Redshirt was obviously a very ambitious game, and I'm really pleased with the sort of areas in which it succeeded, and I know it could do better in others. But it was about taking this genre, this idea which didn't exist before, and just trying to get it out in the world. So this is something that kind of applies not only to game mechanics, but also to the way that we present themes and characters and address the issue of representation in games as well. Because indie developers are in a position to make games about all kinds of people and not just the sort of the demographic that we typically see in high-profile games. And I think this second challenge is something which is not only a design consideration, but it's also a marketing and a business consideration. And really, in the grand scheme of things, it's sort of about impacting like games culture and all media really. Because obviously we live in a fantastically diverse world, but if you look at the vast majority of games, they only paint a picture of a very specific type of character. And obviously in isolation, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And I've never had trouble playing a game and identifying with a character, ever. But the problem is when it's the same type of character over and over again, it starts sort of kind of saying something about who games are for and what is default, as it were. And that is slightly a problematic thing. So yeah, absolutely. you know, the kinds of protagonists we have now are absolutely fine, but we need to see more as well. And there have been some fantastic strides made in recent years in beginning to address issues of inclusiveness. One of the complicated sort of multi-leveled factors that can keep progress happening from happening is the AAA publishers. And you know, a good example of that is Remember Me. So this was Dope Nod Entertainment's first ever sort of major big AAA release. And they had a difficult time getting a publisher deal because of the game's heroine, Lillian. And a number of potential publishers actually refused to invest in a game with a female protagonist because they were convinced that it wouldn't sell. And so the company was under a great deal of pressure to change the lead character to a male character until... Is that some kind of fire alarm? Should we be running? Okay. Oh. Emergency over? Well, that was exciting. But yes. Okay, so the biggest problem is having is the fact that having a female protagonist is a risk at all. And in practice, there's probably not much difference, but we've created this world accidentally where making a character who isn't the sort of typical white dude protagonist seems like a weird political statement to make, but it shouldn't be. You know, it's not being antagonistic, it's just sort of representing the kinds of people that there are in the world. And I think over time we can kind of break down those assumptions so that people can create games about anything that they choose and about any types of characters that they choose. So yeah, for me, being an indie developer means having creative freedom to sort of work on new types of game ideas, but also the freedom to sort of work beyond the sort of status quo of the kinds of things we see. And I think just as creators of media, because we should be considering games as important, to be as important as movies and TV and books, and they totally are. And we should really consider the impact that they have on sort of culture and media. And as people who create media, it's kind of up to us to define the rest of media. So it's this perpetual thing. And we're all different. We're all different types of people, and no one type of identity should be considered default. The way that I handled this in Redshirt, so a lot of it was to do with the character creator. You get to create and play as your own customized character, and there are 6 different alien species to choose from. And I really wanted to make the character creator itself as inclusive as possible, because as an indie you do get to kind of question the sort of default things that games do. And I think character creators say a lot about how we think of categorizing people. So in Redshirt I added a gender slider, which I know isn't the perfect solution, but it was a step I wanted to take, and also sort of address an inclusive view of sexuality as well. So inclusivity has kind of been a key factor in designing that. So just a sort of quick note on making niche indie games. Obviously Redshirt is quite a niche game, it's quite a weird, that's a replacement word I use for weird sometimes, but it's a game that kind of knows its audience, right? And it's people who sort of generally enjoy sort of quirky British humour, and possibly people who will get all the sci-fi references, but you don't have to, and generally just people who have feelings about social networking, whether positive or negative. And it's definitely not a game for everyone, and I kind of knew that at the outset when sort of first conceptualizing the game. And I think that's okay. It's okay to decide to make a game for a particular audience, a niche audience, as it were. Because basically, if there's a game that you think you would like, chances are there are other people who would like it as well, because as much as we like to think so, we're not unique. And if you like something, other people are probably going to like it as well. And I think sort of, one of the weird things that has happened from it being a niche game is that it's had, one of the things I've seen is the game that Redshirt has had quite divisive criticism. People who kind of get the game and like it, sort of really like it, and people who sort of don't quite get it, sort of really hate it. So it's that kind of Marmite type thing, I guess. And it's been really interesting to see that kind of reaction, I guess. And I think some of it might be due to that niche sort of nature. And in terms of criticism, there have definitely been things that people have pointed out which are actual issues of the game, and others are just to do with people, it not being a game for those people. And I think it's really important to be able to distinguish between those two things, right? Because obviously constructive criticism is important, and that's what we learn from. But also, it's okay to accept that not everyone's going to like everything you make, basically. That would be impossible. And I think sort of, learning to know the difference probably comes with experience. So those are the plus sides of being an indie developer. What are sort of some of the problems? I mean, I worked on Redshirt pretty much in a room by myself for the last 2 years, which kind of gets really lonely. And I think that's been one of the big challenges, sort of, like getting out there and, keeping yourself motivated. And, this is why it's so important as well to sort of engage with other indie developers, other people who are in the same situation as you, because they'll really get what it's like to do that. So try if you can, if you live somewhere where there is like an indie community, definitely get yourself out to sort of meetups and network with them, and just spend time with other human beings. It's important. So one of the weird challenges that I found as well, sort of related to that, is that I kind of assumed when I started working on Redshirt that I'd be like blogging and like sharing the whole development process of the game the whole time, but I got sort of partway through and sort of got gripped with this sense of weird sort of perfectionism, where I didn't want to, I was like, no, don't look at it yet, it's not ready. And you kind of have to push yourself past that, and it's okay to show the game to other developers because they're used to seeing things which are kind of broken and not quite finished yet. But it was, obviously, in practice, it becomes sort of difficult to do sometimes, but you just kind of have to push past that. So yeah, that's really important. And you'll have. It's important to know that you'll have good days and you'll have bad days in terms of just how motivated you're feeling. And I think as long as you're sort of, and it's okay to have, and as long as you're sort of prepared for that emotional roller coaster, because it is an emotional roller coaster of working on a game. If you're prepared for it, you'll sort of, it won't be so shocking when it happens, and you'll sort of learn to ride out the sort of low motivation periods. I was going to add a point about choosing your tools carefully. How much time do I have? Okay, I'll wrap up. Okay. Choose your tools carefully. I'll be vague about that. So the whole thing is kind of, it's kind of a continuing journey for me, and I'm still learning all the time. And one of the more recent lessons I've learned is how important it is to have a plan for what you're going to do next. I spent so long kind of so laser focused on finishing Redshirt, and I was like, oh yeah, I'll worry about the next thing when it comes to it, etc. If you're going to, if your plan is to work on your next game, sort of have some ideas ready. I kind of didn't let myself think I had some ideas, and then didn't let myself think about them too much. And that's probably a good thing as well, and there are probably sort of plus points and minus points to sort of not thinking about the next thing yet. But yeah, it's probably helpful in some ways, I'm finding, to have like the next thing lined up, whether it's like funding that you're going for or whatever. So for me, my next step in the sort of short term is doing all the things that I told you about, like sort of, continuing to just sort of, work on tiny little prototypes. Like I did a game jam while I was traveling last week, and just sort of also engaging with as much media as I can, and watching, because I'm bad at following my own advice basically, because I stopped watching movies, and I stopped playing other games, and I stopped reading books, and it's so important to do that, and I think I want to sort of like from a personal point of view, aim for a better balance for that stuff for my next game. Because just as a creative, it's just so important to do. So just to wrap up, what's next for you? Ultimately, that sort of absorbing lots of other media, etc., is what we need in order for the industry and its ideas to grow. You all have your own unique perspectives in life, I'm sure, because you're all different people, and I'm sure you'd all make sort of fantastic games about your own experiences if you're asked to sort of make a game about something that you've personally experienced or whatever, rather than something you've only experienced in the game world. And I think, just experimenting is so important, and I absolutely encourage you all to do that. If you love games and care about games, I hope that you sort of want to also see them grow as a medium and explore their full potential. And I basically hope to see what you can all do. Thank you. Are there any questions?
Any questions, or maybe Joe, you want to set up or no?
Shall I give you the top? I don't know if I'll take one.
Any questions?
What advice would you give about tools to use?
Well, actually, is this one on? Okay, yeah, it is. I used Unity to make Redshirt, and obviously Redshirt is a very sort of 2D, very user interface heavy game. So that ultimately ended up being a bad decision because I spent more time sort of rewriting bits of the sort of third-party libraries that I was using to make to do the 2D stuff. That it sort of didn't really work out in terms of the time that I wanted to save while using Unity. So I think it's really about, and I think this is a lesson you kind of learn just through experience. Just sort of really investigate the tools you're going to use. If you haven't used something before to make that kind of thing you're going to make, you should probably try and do that for like a tiny thing, which is something I didn't do. Like I'd done sort of like small game jam 3D things in Unity, but not like a 2D thing. But I was like, oh, it'll be fine, but it wasn't.
Any other questions?
What's your favourite and least favourite aspects of Redshirt as a finished product?
I think, and again, this sort of like goes back, okay, my favourite part is the sort of moments that can happen in the game. The sort of moments where, and this is like, I enjoy hearing people's stories of playing Redshirt, like relationships that they have with characters and like how they can go awry in different ways, and just, those are things that I obviously didn't specifically architect, but they're just things that can happen. Just like, in a sort of emergent way in the game. And that's just, I really enjoyed that about the game. The way those things can just happen. My least favourite thing is probably just, I feel like I didn't get to flesh out sort of the way the story progresses so much. And I think if I had more time to work on it, that's probably the main thing I'd work on.
Last question.
Do you think that revealing a game early, like a level of it, can make it more difficult to make the final game more impressive?
This is something I have mixed feelings on. I think there's definitely probably a sweet spot in like announcing a game. It's obviously difficult, and I thought that, when I thought that Redshirt was going to take not quite as long to develop, we did announce it at the sweet spot, because we announced it like basically maybe about 8 months into development, and then it had another like year and like a half of development before it actually came out. So I don't know, it's funny because I saw Chris Hacker, who worked on Spy Party, specifically saying at GDC, don't announce your game too early, because he's been working on that for like 5 years, and that probably is too early to announce. But then again, you kind of want to be in the public consciousness of like, this is what I'm working on. So it's a difficult struggle. That probably isn't an answer at all, but I don't know. I'm not sure if anyone knows.
Okay, that's great. We got another round of applause for Mitu.